Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Classroom Hacks book review, or I should say, the review for the podcast of the Trojan Horse Affair. But before we get into all of that, just a reminder, we are live from the Pantheon of Pedagogy, the mecca of methodology, your vacation from vacation, your educational excursion, where you can learn to seriously take teaching not so seriously. This is, and we are, Classroom Hacks. And welcome back to another review. This time we're going to take a segue away from the book review, and we're going to review something a little bit different from the people who brought you S-Town. We're going to be reviewing the podcast series, The Trojan Horse Affair. And before we get into that, just a little background and synopsis for those of you who might have heard about this, but didn't really know what it was about. Here's the little background from the New York Times, who is one of the companies that help produce this particular series. And so the synopsis is: a strange letter appears on a city councilor's desk in Birmingham, England, laying out an elaborate plot by Islamic extremists to infiltrate the city's schools. The plot has a code name, Operation Trojan Horse. The story soon explodes into the news and kicks off a national panic. By the time it all dies down, the government has launched multiple investigations, beefed up the country's counterterrorism policy, revamped schools, and banned people from education for the rest of their lives. To Hamza Saeed, who is watching the scandal unfold in his city, the whole thing seemed off, because through all the official inquiries and heated speeches in Parliament, no one has ever even bothered to answer a basic question: who wrote the letter and why? The night before Hamza is to start journalism school, he has a chance meeting in Birmingham with reporter Brian Reed, the host of the hit podcast S-Town. Together, they team up to investigate who wrote the Trojan Horse letter, but they quickly discover that it's a question people in power do not want them asking. From Sierra Productions and the New York Times comes the Trojan Horse Affair, a mystery in 8 parts. And so that's basically the breakdown and the synopsis, the little preamble, if you will, to what you can expect in the Trojan Horse Affair. So if you've ever listened to S-Town, you know how Brian Reed does his sort of investigating, how he breaks it up, and he goes and he interviews different people, and he puts this wonderful story together about some sort of underlying mystery on top of a bigger scandal or a bigger issue at or below the surface. And so we see this sort of same approach with the Trojan Horse Affair. However, there are a few added benefits to this particular podcast, and we're going to kind of go over those as well. And so to kind of continue on with the primary plot point, so basically Hamza, who is this new journalism student, he approaches Brian at this sort of speaking event, and he tells him about the story about the Trojan Horse letter that apparently was the cause of a lot of controversy. It got a lot of people removed from their positions in academia and education, and it eventually started this sort of campaign to really redirect focus on how teaching was done in school, especially in areas that were primarily Muslim, and that ultimately led to a larger scare of how these sort of schools were teaching extremist points of views and how they were trying to sort of minimize that perception in the hopes of national security. And some of the things that we see throughout this sort of exploration is, one, how this letter was sort of the catalyst to starting up this bigger brouhaha, which eventually turned into a much bigger issue for many Muslims, many people in that educational sector in Birmingham, and how it was sort of used to catapult a lot of different sort of governmental policies that changed the landscape of how things were sort of run in England, and why it was important to sort of address those things in the podcast. And so basically, Brian and Hamza go on to sort of unearth the original letter, and they start looking at it from perspectives that weren't really addressed in the initial sort of investigation, as any good journalists will do. They try to ask questions and get to the bottom and root of all this conspiracy. And basically at the core of it is who wrote the letter. You see this sort of underlying current throughout the entire podcast series. And as they get to different parts and turns and corners of this investigation, they are consistently confronted with not just who wrote the letter, but why wasn't the letter a primary point of focus? And then when it became a primary point of focus, even after it was dismissed as being nonsense or being unimportant, this eventually was used in different court trials and was used as the basis to sort of launch the campaign against Islam and Muslims in Birmingham. And so the letter went from being completely unsubstantiated and unimportant to being an extremely important sort of crux that people used in order to get agendas moved and points across. And so, as with any good show or any bit of investigation or any great quality television program out there, i.e., Breaking Bad, Mad Men, The Walking Dead, there's always the surface level stuff. So in Breaking Bad, you're talking about making meth. In Mad Men, you're talking about making advertisements. And in Breaking Bad, with The Walking Dead, we're looking at zombies. But the reality of what makes those shows good isn't what's on the surface. It's what's beneath, essentially the human condition and how people operate within these worlds that are dealing with many of these other crises or issues. And in the same breath or token, you can say that the Trojan Horse Affair is similar in that respect, that on the surface level, you have this letter, this incomplete letter that's on the surface, but beneath that, you see the issues dealing with Islamophobia, the perception of Muslims, the sort of social hierarchy and bureaucracy, not only in academics and education, but also in government, and how sort of this investigation becomes much more complex, especially as they start unearthing things and asking questions that essentially were not asked originally or sort of overlooked. And the other area that is sort of done rather well that I enjoyed, I know there have been some critiques about this particular aspect of it, but there is a little bit of a buddy comedy mixed into this. And maybe buddy comedy might be a little more lighthearted approach, but the sort of relationship and tag team of Brian and Hamza is very interesting, at least from my perspective it was. You have Hamza, the fresh-faced, doughy-eyed, new to sort of journalism student, but he is an educated individual. He's highly intelligent. He was a doctor before, and now he's going into journalism, and he has a passion for it. And one of his primary credos is, what's the point of doing something if you can't make a change or you don't have a passion for the thing that you're doing and it doesn't mean much to you? And then you have Brian, who is the skilled veteran. He is very good at nuance. He's very good at talking to people, very good at keeping even keel. But he does have to sort of remove himself from the sort of emotional aspect that gets attached to it that Hamza finds himself getting wrapped up in a lot. So you have a lot of this balance, this ebb and flow between the two of them. And it's an extremely interesting way to get you invested, because there's times where you're like, you need to be more nuanced. You need to be more like Brian. And then there's times you really sympathize and empathize with Hamza, especially if you're someone from a minority background that has dealt with being suppressed in some way, and you want to see change because you've been dealing with oppressive people your whole life. So how do you remove yourself from something that involves you? And to transition to the areas or the themes that you could cover if you wanted to sort of utilize this in your classroom, you have themes such as Islamophobia, the sort of undercurrent of the controversy that sort of gets swelled up in the discussion. You see it initially starting with a change in a particular school in Birmingham, and you see that change as the school goes from being one of the worst rated schools to being one of the best rated schools academically. But then you also see a transition of, well, this change isn't just happening through the education that the particular population was accustomed to, but now you have Muslims running the school, and they're also trying to incorporate their religious teachings, which isn't an issue, but it becomes an issue when other people start looking at their religious teachings as extremist or as problematic because of the other cultural elements that sort of get involved with that. And you can start to see, as the story develops, how some of those perceptions snowball and how some of those perceptions lead to particular scenarios that might not have been entirely accurate even though the individual might have thought he or she was doing what was best for the larger audience or the larger population, despite her own misgivings. There's the themes of perception and authority. If you were to sort of use this in a class discussion, you can talk about how our personal perceptions might judge, or how they might cloud our judgment in terms of how we see other people. And then you can have your class sort of look for examples. You could bring in different articles or different videos and ask them what their initial judgments are about a particular topic, and then transition to ask them, well, how do you think your judgment was shaped? Do you think that your perception is skewed in some way because of the things you've been exposed to or what you haven't been exposed to? You can look at themes of authority, which is always a good one because there's different levels of authority that are being addressed in this particular book, or I'm sorry, in this particular podcast. And we see that with each level of authority that Hamza and Brian get to, that there is a blockade or some sort of obstacle that they have to overcome. One type of theme that we do often see is investigation, where we see this sort of unearthed document come to light, and the way that they reinvestigate and they do additional research and they ask questions that haven't been used before. One thing that I would do in my class, if I was going to use sort of the investigatory theme for this particular assignment, is I'd have my students look up potentially old topics that might have been disregarded, old case studies, old issues, old court cases within the Supreme Court or in their local town, and then try to unearth certain things or perspectives that maybe weren't asked at the time or weren't looked into because there wasn't the technology, there wasn't the knowledge, there wasn't the aftermath of things that have happened, and see what sort of new questions you could sort of form based on the things that weren't asked initially. And then the final sort of discussion that you can sort of look at is this sort of modernist take. And this is where I think that some people, and including myself, were a little bit, I shouldn't say upset, but this is, if I had one primary critique of this podcast, it would be this, that as with many modern pieces of writing or podcasts or just stories being told, they never have closure, or the type of closure you would expect from the hero comes and saves the day, or the woman gets justice over the man who wronged her, or some sort of closure that leaves the audience, and as they say in wrestling, you send your audience home happy. In a modern sort of discussion, there isn't that sort of closure because life goes on. That's not how the real world is. You don't always get the closure you seek, and the story sort of ends that way. And without giving away too much, that was my primary critique of this particular piece. I enjoyed all the elements of it, even though some people didn't enjoy the two-sided approach of the investigation. I really appreciated having the 2 points of view between Brian and Hamza, and then the skilled journalist versus the impassioned freshman or new person bringing fresh eyes to the discussion. I enjoyed that. But what I did feel fell a bit short was that ending, to me, sort of just was a bit abrupt. And not only did we not get closure, obviously, as I said, you're not going to get that type of closure you expect, but you don't really get any, well, this is what Brian's doing now, or this is what Hamza's doing now, or this is what happens after several months go by. So I wish there was just some way to at least give some sort of insight into that, maybe just an additional shorter episode that kind of shows where they are now, because I know one of the issues that came up was whether or not Hamza was going to continue in journalism, and that was something that I wish that they at least would have addressed at the end of it. Overall, the Trojan Horse Affair does receive a 4 or a 4.5 out of 5 on my scale. I would say it is definitely an A rating worthy podcast to listen to. As I said, if you enjoyed S-Town, you will definitely enjoy the Trojan Horse Affair. If you want a great mystery, this is one of them. If you want multiple perspectives and different reoccurring themes that touch on sort of prejudice and discrimination, Islamophobia, perception and authority, investigation, this is your particular podcast. And it will definitely get you riled up at times. It'll make you root for them as they sort of search for this end goal of who wrote the letter. But like I said, the only thing that really gets to me was that ending, because as any good piece should do, it should make you want more. And they do an excellent job in doing that. but I do feel it fell a bit short. But other than that, would highly recommend this particular podcast for you guys to listen to. It does fly by fast. It is 8 episodes, so it's not super long, but they are definitely fulfilling. They are definitely doing a great job with their investigation, and it's definitely worth your time for a listen. The next time we come back for our next review, we will be reviewing Neil Gaiman's Norse Mythology. If you are a fan of Stephen Fry's mythos or heroes, this is another great writer telling great mythological stories, and I can't wait to review it because this was definitely one that I really enjoyed, especially being a huge fan of Neil Gaiman. So until next time, fellow hacks, I will see you around.